The economic story of Colombia begins long before European arrival, with indigenous groups like the Muisca, Tayrona, and Quimbaya developing sophisticated agrarian societies. From around 12,000 BCE, hunter-gatherers transitioned to farming, cultivating crops such as maize, potatoes, yuca, and beans on terraced fields in the Andean highlands and river valleys. They wove fique fibers into textiles and baskets, traded salt and emeralds, and crafted gold artifacts, creating localized economies based on barter and communal labor. Population estimates for the eve of colonization hover around 2-4 million, with no formal GDP concept applicable, but these societies sustained self-sufficient production without large-scale monetization. Spanish colonization in 1499 transformed this into an extractive economy. The Viceroyalty of New Granada, encompassing modern Colombia, focused on mining gold and emeralds from indigenous lands, using forced labor systems like the encomienda, where natives were compelled to work mines and farms in exchange for protection. By the 16th century, gold exports to Spain totaled millions of pesos annually, but this enriched the crown while devastating local populations through disease and exploitation. Indigenous numbers plummeted from millions to hundreds of thousands. Agriculture shifted to export-oriented cash crops like tobacco and sugar on haciendas, fueled by African slave labor imported via the transatlantic trade. Over 100,000 slaves by 1700. Trade was monopolized through ports like Cartagena, limiting local industry to basic goods. By the 18th century, mining declined and agriculture dominated, with cattle ranching and indigo adding to exports. The economy grew modestly through Bourbon reforms in the late 1700s, which eased trade restrictions, but inequality soared, setting the stage for independence movements. No reliable GDP estimates exist, but per capita output likely stagnated around subsistence levels, equivalent to $500, $800 in today's international dollars. Independence from Spain in 1819, led by Simón Bolívar, freed Colombia, then Gran Colombia, including modern Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, from mercantilist constraints, but ushered in instability. The economy fragmented into regional fiefdoms reliant on artisanal mining, cattle ranching, and nascent agriculture. Civil wars, 1820s, 1880s, disrupted trade, with exports like tobacco and hides generating modest revenues. Total exports around 10 to 20 million annually by mid-century. Coffee emerged as a star in the 1870s, cultivated on small Andean farms, boosting exports to 50 million by 1890. Land concentration in elite hands persisted, with sharecropping and peonage replacing slavery, abolished 1851. The War of a Thousand Days, 1899-1902, devastated the economy, causing thousands of deaths and infrastructure ruin. Population grew from 1.5 million in 1820 to 4 million by 1900. Historical estimates suggest GDP per capita hovered at $600 to $900 1990 international dollars from Madison data, with average annual growth under 1% amid political turmoil. No decade-by-decade GDP figures exist, but the period marked a shift from colonial extraction to export-led agriculture, laying foundations for modernization. The 1900s saw recovery from civil war driven by coffee's rise. Exports surged from 10% of total in 1900 to 60% by 1920, fueled by US and European demand. Railroads expanded over 2,000 kilometers by 1930, linking farms to ports like Buenaventura, and foreign investment flowed in. Banana plantations in the Urabá region added diversity. The Great Depression hit hard in the 1930s, slashing coffee prices by 60%, but government interventions like price support stabilized the sector. World War II boosted commodity prices, aiding recovery. Manufacturing began modestly with textiles and food processing under import substitution policies. Population doubled to 8-9 million by 1940. From Madison estimates, GDP per capita rose from $1,000 in 1900 to $500 by 1950, 1990 in $10, with average growth all 2% per decade. Total GDP likely reached 2 or 3 billion current US dollars by 1940. The 1948 Bogotazo riots and La Violencia, 1948-1958 civil strife slowed progress, displacing rural economies. The 1950s marked economic stabilization under the National Front Pact 1958-1974, ending violence and promoting unity. Coffee remained king, but oil discoveries, Barco Field, and coal mining diversified exports. Import substitution, industrialization, ISI, policies protected local factories with GDP growth averaging 4 to 5% annually. By 1960, GDP was $4.03 billion, population 16.4 million, per capita $246, our world share 0.2%. Growth accelerated to 5.7% in the 1960s, driven by manufacturing, textiles, cement, and infrastructure like highways. The 1967 devaluation shifted toward export promotion. Decade end, 1970, GDP 8.8 billion, population 20.6 million per capita, 427, growth ABG 5.2%, which is 0%. Decade GDP, with current US 3.3, 1950 to 4.0, B's 1959, GDP billions 4B, ABG growth rate 4.5%, population 12.8, 1950 to 16, GDP capita 290, world Japan, high coffee prices post 1970 for us in Brazil fueled a boom, with exports doubling to 2 billion by 1975. Oil production ramped up and emeralds became a niche export. Growth averaged 5.2%, but inflation hit 20% amid fiscal expansion. ISI continued, with auto and chemical industries growing. By 1980, GDP 34.3 billion, population 26.0 million, per capita 1,219, world share 0.4%. The decade saw urbanization, 50% urban by 1979, and rising inequality with guerrillas disrupting rural areas. Decade GDP, current USO 8.8B, 1970 to 34.3B, 1979. GDP billions, 34B, AVG, so growth percent to 5.2%. Population 20.6 to 25.6. GDP capita 11319. World share percent 0.4%. Colombia avoided the worst of Latin America's debt crisis through conservative policies, but coffee prices crashed in 1982 and inflation peaked at 25%. Oil exports rose to 20% of total, and non-traditional exports like flowers grew. Drug trafficking, cocaine injected illicit billions, 4B annually by late 1980s, distorting the economy via money laundering but funding violence. Growth slowed to 3.5% average, with 1989 liberalization opening trade. By 1990, GDP 53.7 billion, population 30.9 million, per capita 1,737, world share 0.45%. Decade GDP, current USO 34.3B, 1980 to 53.7B, 1989, GDP billions 54B, AVG growth percent 3.5%, population 26.0 mer to 30.9 mer, GDP capital 737, world share percent 0.45%. Early 1990s reforms, trade opening, central bank independence spurred 4% growth via oil and manufacturing, but fiscal decentralization ballooned debt to 30% of GDP. The 1998-99 recession growth, 4.2% in 1999, stemmed from Asian crisis spillover, banking collapse, and El Niño droughts. Unemployment hit 20%. IMF bailout stabilized things. Population 37.0 million by 1999. Decade end GDP 102 billion. Per capita 2,758, and world share 0.5%. Decade GDP, current USO 53.7B 1990 to 102B 1999. GDP billions 102B. AVG On growth percent, 3.2%, population 30.9 million to 37.0 m, GDP capita 2,758 chut, world share percent to 0.5%. Under President Uribe, 2002-2010, security improvements reduced violence, attracting FDI 10B plus annually by 2008. Oil, coal, and flowers drove exports. Free trade agreements, US 2012, boosted non-traditionals. Growth averaged 4.5%, peaking at 7.5% in 2007 amid commodity boom. Global financial crisis slowed 2009 to 1.7%. By 2010, GDP $286 billion, population 44.2 million, per capita $478. World share 0.55%. Decade GDP, current US 102B 2000 to 286B 2009. GDP billions 286B. AVG growth percent 4.5%. Population 37.0 mem to 44.2 mets. GDP capita 6,478. World share she percent 0.55%. The 2010s began strong, 4.5% growth 2010, with mining, coal, gold, and manufacturing expanding. The 2016 FARC Peace Accord promised rural investment, but falling oil prices from 100 barrel 2014 to 30 2016 triggered recession, 0.4% 2017, 1.8%. Diversification to services, IT, tourism helped growth average 3.2%. By 2019, GDP $324 billion, population 49.6 million, per capita 6,514, world share 0.58%. Decade GDP, current US 286B 2010 to 324B 2019. GDP billions 324B AVG. Growth percent 3.2%, population 44.2 million to 49.6, GDP capita 6,540, world share percent 0.58%. COVID-19 hammered 2020, 6.8% growth with lockdowns slashing tourism and oil. Recovery was robust, 10.6% in 2021, 7.3% 2022 on stimulus and exports. 2023 growth 0.6% amid inflation, 13% and El Nino. 2024 to 2.0%. GDP for 18.5 billion, population 52.9 million, per capita 7,140, world share 0.6%. Under Petro 2022, focus shifts to renewables, reducing fossil fuel dependence, oil 50% exports, with challenges from inequality, Gini 0.52, and migration. Projected 2025 growth 2.4%, emphasizing sustainable agriculture and digital economy. Year 2020 GDP, current US 235B, GDP billions 270B, growth percent 6.8%, population 51.5 mem, GDP capita 5,249, world share percent 0.56%. 2021 GDP, current US $318.53B, GDP billions 9B, growth percent 10.6%, population 51.5 mem, GDP capita 6,181, world share percent 0.58%. 22 GDP, current US $345.63B, GDP billions 346B, growth percent 7.3%, population 51.9 mem, GDP capita 6,660, world share 0.6%. 22 GDP as critical SR 363 set, GDP billions 36B, growth percent 0.6%, population 52.2, GDP capita 69.65, world share from 0.2024 GDP, current US 4 GDP billions 4B, growth percent 20%, population 52.9, GDP capita 7,940, world share Sachi share and Kasatel Colombia's economy has evolved from indigenous subsistence to a middle-income, export-driven powerhouse, resilient despite violence and volatility. Key drivers: commodities, coffee, oil, diversification, and policy shifts. Challenges persist in inequality and sustainability, but growth prospects remain positive.